told him that I was a newly minted third officer. We still had those Girl Scout ranks at that point. But it was good. It was good. I got to be a training officer when they opened up the, at that point, Third WAC Training Center in Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia. And Georgia was a bit of a difference. You know, Iowa was kind of close. We're still Midwest. But going down to Georgia, that was, I guess culture shock's probably the best word. I'd never seen segregation before. I'd read about it, we knew about it, but I'd never seen it in practice until that point. The water fountains, the color lines on the buses, that was a lot. But being able to set up a new training center was good, and being one of the company officers for the 22nd Training Regiment, I was really proud of that. I was proud of all my girls, getting them through basic training, and when training expanded to a 5th week, that was good. You know, those 4 weeks I had, we were feeling a little rushed and pinched at that point. Unlike, you know, when my brother enlisted, he got to go to an induction center, and they got all the paperwork and shots and issued things out of the way there, but we just had to roll it into basic. And adding that 5th week and sending the girls to the reception battalion first worked much better. And it was while I was at Fort Oglethorpe that we found out that we were finally going to drop those Girl Scout ranks and drop the auxiliary status. No longer would we be the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. We were going to become the Women's Army Corps and truly be part of the U.S. Army. We got rid of those silly little plastic buttons and that walking buzzard on our caps, and finally got to wear the Army of the United States crest. I was so proud. That day in August when we took our oath of enlistment in the Army of the United States, not just the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. It was almost a year to the day after showing up at Des Moines, and a lot had happened in that year, and now I think how much has happened since. And then they started telling us that they were going to start opening up more opportunities for us to serve overseas. Now, we'd had WACs in North Africa since December of '42. The first WACs had arrived in England just the same month that bill was passed. But now they're saying that more of us could have the chance, so I volunteered again. I guess in triplicate, I volunteered to join, I volunteered to stay in, and I volunteered to come over here. So they gave me a week's leave to go home and visit my parents. It was wonderful. Got to see the family. Actually got to make a long distance call up to my grandparents and my aunts and uncles up in Detroit. That was really special. Get to talk to them. But I got back from that, and extended field service training was actually back at Fort Oglethorpe, so I didn't get to see the other training centers. But had 2 weeks, and they told us it was going to be like summer camp, and it was not at all like summer camp. It was all the hardest parts of basic training, the monotony, the marching. But they told us they were going to make sure that we were up to the rigors of overseas service. I think my least favorite part was all the spinach. I thought I liked spinach before that, but after they served it to us breakfast, lunch, and dinner for 2 weeks straight, I was pretty tired of it. I've been writing back to some of the girls since then, and they said they fixed that and got some new leadership over there to make sure the meals were a little more balanced. But the uniforms too. You think these are stylish. Those, I think, had been worn by at least 8 other women before me. We got to rent them for 2 weeks and then send them right back. Marching all over Chickamauga battlefield with full packs, I couldn't help but to think about the previous generations of my family that had been there under very different circumstances, but still fighting for democracy and freedom. And I kind of felt like I was carrying on their tradition and hopefully making them proud. So I get done with training there and didn't know where I was going to be headed. Certainly wasn't going to guess here so fast. We weren't told until after they issued us stuff. So once I started getting my uniforms, I figured it was either Italy or England. Didn't think they'd be sending me to North Africa with quite so much wool. So they sent us off to Hampton Roads and boarded us up on a ship And that last bit of staging, when we couldn't talk to anyone at all, some of the girls were having lots of problems with it. We had one that found out that her fiance was in town, and he got a hold of her just as we were going into the staging area, asking if he could meet her, and they hadn't seen each other for months, but I couldn't approve that pass. I felt so bad. We also had another woman who just found out that her best friend's husband had gone off the deep end a little bit and put her in a pretty bad way, and the baby didn't survive. And she begged and begged and begged to call and head home, and I couldn't approve that one either, couldn't get the orders through. I lost track of her once we landed over in England, but I hope everything turned out okay. The passing wasn't too easy. Had to zigzag a lot for those U-boats. That's when I found out I got seasick pretty easily, actually. And I was never so happy to see dry land as when we landed in Gurrock, Scotland. And then it was such a wonderful welcome. I mean, they had the bagpipers out for us. It was a full parade. I was so excited to tell my dad about it. And I hope I captured it in the letter home to him. But oh, it was special. And then we loaded up on a train. It took us to London. It was great. We ended up being built in a few different apartments across London throughout that spring. Got the last little bit of bombing out of the way as well. I don't know how the Brits have done it for so long, dealing with the bombs. I mean, they told us about it before we got there, but it's not till your first air raid that you really understand it and understand everything this war means and everything that we're fighting for. Actually, our first billets were bombed and we had to move because we couldn't stay in them anymore. Luckily, we weren't there when the bomb hit. We were all at work in the office, but trying to pick through the rubble for our things and get everything relocated. Luckily, the PX had replacements for what we couldn't get. And then we ended up in Evelyn Mansions, and they were beautiful. We were right near the Thames. And then, as we're doing our work, which was top secret, we knew what we were working towards. We knew we were working towards the invasion. But that Tuesday, when we get the news that it's happening, the amount of pride I felt in what we had done and the communications work we were doing to help ensure that we crossed that channel and had that foothold finally on the continent. I still get chills thinking about it. And then it was just 10 days later they announced that we are going to start getting ready to head over, that the beachheads were secured, and it's going to be our turn next, that they need us to do the logistics to make sure that we can keep the front moving. So we start our training, and I thought I had enough marching done through overseas training in Fort Oglethorpe, but we needed another round of it. So we marched between Evelyn Mansions and Battersea Park and all around Battersea Park. We practice our tent pitching. We practice our French lessons. But most excitedly, and you know, we can talk about it, but we're still not allowed to write home about this or tell anybody else. We got to train on carbines. And some of these girls had obviously never picked up a gun before in their lives. You could tell the city girls real fast. And they didn't give us a lot of practice on them. You know, 3 afternoons, we learned how to take it apart. And growing up on the farm, we had a couple little rifles. I had my shotgun. It came back pretty easily. So we got to take it apart, learn the parts of the gun. We learned how to sight it in, pretty standard stuff. And then we had 10 rounds to familiarize ourselves with it. And I think some of those girls, I think they got the 10 rounds downrange in generally the right direction. We may have been more of a risk than the Jerrys were at that point. But we got through it. And then they took them back. We're not allowed to be armed. We're still non-combatants, and it's pretty hush-hush that they gave us that much. But they wanted to be sure, just in case things happened, we could protect ourselves. And then it was typical Army life, hurry up and wait. Hurry up and wait, hurry up and wait. And trying to go back to office work after that, knowing that we're going to get ready at any time to cross the channel, it was hard to focus on things. But then, last week we finally got the call, pack up. And we loaded up our barracks bags, we loaded up our musette bags, our gas mask bags, and the 110 of us that had been practicing in Evelyn Mansions, well, now it's us 55. And that's when we got to find out that we also had 6 war correspondents with us. And everything I've heard from the other officers is we're the only unit to have 6 female war correspondents following us. So our stories home are going to be really important. Now they're civilians, and they're dressed up in the same uniforms as us, but you can pick them out pretty fast. They don't know how to wear their gear. I mean, one of those women, Coyne, I think her name was, she had her leggings on the wrong feet, stood up, tried to take 2 steps, and got them so tangled together she ended up flat on her face. The other one, was it Barden, Judy Barden? She shows up with 2 musette bags, and I don't even know where she got the second one or what she was going to put in it. And they're all loaded down with their typewriters, their photos. I mean, I, for one, am all about making sure I have my face on before anybody sees me, but they are taking pictures all the time, and if I end up in the paper, I want to make sure I'm looking my best. But my favorite's actually Dot Avery. She's writing for Detroit Free Press, and not only do I like how she writes, I know that her articles are going to end up being read by the family, because my aunt and uncle are going to make sure that once they read the paper, the clippings are going to get sent to mom and dad. And they'll probably read it before my letters make it even home. So they'll know what's happening before I can tell them what's happening. But it's still nice to try to talk to them that way and tell them what's going on. And even though the wait for letters is long, it's worth it. It's nice to know they're proud of me and they approve of this. Some of the girls, their parents did not approve at all. They were against them joining. They were against them coming overseas. And it's pretty lonesome if you don't have your family behind you. But again, like, just to be here finally in France, I mean, landing yesterday and then doing that walk across Utah Beach and seeing what's left from the invasion, getting on the truck and going through the countryside and looking at the foxholes and the bomb craters and everything that our boys have gone through. I'm ready for the war to be over. I'm ready to do my part. And while this camp is pretty rough, I grew up camping, but at least it was on the back of the farm and we still had access to the pump. I mean, all I've seen so far are Lister bags, and this helmet's going to start becoming very dear. It's going to be soup pot, wash stand, everything pretty soon. One of the girls says she's going to start a beauty parlor and get a few of our helmets together, and she'll start doing wet sets and haircuts for us. I'm sure the war correspondents will have a heyday writing about that one back home. Beauty parlor outside of Eloyne. But as rough as it is, we don't have generators except for what's going to run the communications equipment. I got my flashlight in my pack. That'll do for tonight. It's still good. Our boys are moving through the front, and if we can get those communications line going, we're going to start moving over the rest of the unit, and then we'll have the transportation unit coming through. I think we can make Paris the next couple months. And if we can make Paris, then we got our foothold. And then we're going to beat Jerry back, and we'll get Europe soon enough. I'm a little more worried about the war going on in the Pacific. And I mentioned earlier my brother enlisted right after Pearl Harbor, and he's an engineer, and even though we're both Army, I don't know where he is other than somewhere in the Pacific. And he promises me in his letters that he's not too close to the front and he's pretty safe. But I also know my baby brother, and I'm pretty sure he's just telling me that so I don't worry too much about him. It'll be good to see him once this war's over and make sure he stays safe. I keep telling him if he can get a transfer over here, we'll take him, but I think it's probably more likely I'll get a transfer there first before he gets a transfer here. Now the rumor is, in this lovely little apple orchard of ours, that we're going to start getting some entertainment soon. and the girls have a little betting pool off to the side. I'm hoping it's Bing Crosby. We were able to see him at Fort Oglethorpe, and he was wonderful. No, not everybody approves of us women being in this Army, but he was so nice to all the girls, shaking hands, taking pictures, signing autographs, and it was just an absolute honor to have him on the post. You know, as rough as Fort Oglethorpe was, and Georgia was, and as different as it was, that heat and humidity was a little rough sometimes. It was just, sometimes I get homesick for it, you know? You get comfortable someplace, you get used to something, and you start missing things you never thought you'd miss. So I'm sure I'll feel that way about this place soon. But for now, I'm just trying to get settled in, get used to things. I'm ready to get my tent set up, get things a little more in place, get my nails painted. They're getting a little chipped. And I know it seems silly, you know, dressed like this, so stylish, and what Uncle Sam's deemed appropriate for field wear. But it's those little things, you know, making sure your hair's up, not just in regulation, but in something that makes you feel comfortable. Taking those few minutes to paint your nails and get the polish on them and just think and breathe, writing those letters home. As an officer, I get to read all the other girls' letters home, and it's hard sometimes, you know. I want to respect their privacy, but we have to make sure we're censoring things, and sometimes you start reading through what the other women are feeling and going through, and you don't know how to approach them. It's hard being a woman in a man's army and everything that's going on. You know, last year we went through that slander campaign, and the recruiting numbers slumped. I mean, there were radio hosts and newspapers talking about how awful women were for joining the Women's Army Corps, that the only women that belonged in service were the nurses, and you know, they were doing women's work, but what's wrong with us for being Amazons who just wanted to order men around? And you know, I feel like at this point in my life I can shake a lot of that off, but some of these girls, you know, they're 21, 22, 23, and they don't know what they're going to go through. It's rough, and you think through what happened after the last war, and we thought we had it done and over with when we passed the auxiliary bill and the WAC bill, and we're still fighting it. Hopefully, with what we're doing here, we can prove ourselves, and we can prove that we belong, that we have contributed to the war effort, that we are helping to bring the war to a speedy end. You know, when the transition period happened, we were all given a choice to stay in or leave, and some of the gals that left, they said they did it because they thought they could help the war effort more at home. And I look at where we are now. I mean, if they'd stayed in, they could be here with us. They could be actually so close to the front. They could be near the action. And I mean, since arriving in England, I've had such a direct look at what I've been doing and how it is helping the war effort. You know, the messages we process through the message center are coming straight from the front. It's not just the news wires and the telegraphs coming across after several jumps, making it back to the training center. It's finally real here. I mean, we need them in the factories, but we need them here too. And I don't know. We're hoping we have this war done and wrapped up by Christmas. I think being home by Christmas of '44 sounds pretty good, don't you? You know, England was great, even with the bombing and all the training. Those few months we had over there in London to sightsee, being able to see some of the artworks I had studied in college in that art history program. I'm hoping by the time we make it to Paris, there's something left for us to see. And maybe, who knows, after Paris, Berlin, Austria, we'll see. This is a trip of a lifetime, not the way I wanted to do it, but at least I'm doing it. And I don't know about you guys, but I'm proud to be here. And it's been a long day. I'm getting pretty tired. I hear tonight's menu's chicken a la king, And there's an MP battalion nearby that say they're going to do a dance tomorrow. I don't know about you, but these are not my dancing shoes. But I guess there will be plenty of time to dance in pretty dresses and heels after the war. And when we were on the truck earlier, they were all shouting about how nice it was to see an American girl. At first, they thought we were all men since we're all dressed the same. But one of the gals yelled back. Then they started hooting and hollering. So, you know, I know we're not here for morale purposes, but it'll be good to see the boys and maybe give them a little bit of a break. Again, it's been 2 years since I joined, not even. I can't believe we're here. You know, the switchboards we have are going all over Normandy. We have hundreds of wires running from the linemen up at the front in the combat units, the tanker units, and they come back to us, and we help transfer those lines. We have telephones, we have telegraphs, we have teletypes. I mean, the only thing we don't have is pigeons, and that's because they failed so miserably on D-Day. They thought we were going to use them, and they released them in the middle of the channel, and they went up in the tops of the ships and didn't go any farther. So I guess that is now part of Grandpa's war. Now we're not keeping them forward. Pigeons are going to stay in the last war. But it's amazing everything we've achieved so far. And while it's a lot to achieve yet, you know, we still hear the booms in the distance. We still see how much is moving through. I mean, the supply dumps that we have ready to resupply the front lines are amazing. I mean, I have my gas mask bag here, but we went past a pile of them, and it was at least 2 of me tall. And then you just see the crates and the crates and the crates. I was happy to see a pretty large stack of Coca-Cola, so hopefully some of those can make it to us too. It is one of my guilty pleasures, and I'm glad that they're only 5 cents for the PX, and it is one of those nice things, kind of like painting my nails. Taste of home. Well, I don't know about you guys, but I think I'm ready to drop some of this gear, maybe get a little more relaxed. Hopefully we don't need the gas mask tonight. And at that point, I will break character and talk about what happened after that. So I was portraying a member of the Forward Echelon Communications Zone. They were the first WACs to land and stay on the continent at D+38. And it was a group of 55 women, 49 enlisted WACs, 6 WAC officers, and 6 female war correspondents who were all writing home, and their articles were ending up only 2 days delayed from when they were actually happening. So the news were actually coming home in the newspapers before any of the letters, even V-mail as fast as it was, could make it home. Many of them ended up staying into the occupation period of the war. They were joined by 800 plus other women in this apple orchard outside of Boulogne. And then eventually that became the staging area for them to move through to Paris. About 3,000 WACs ended up in and around Paris by VE Day. We moved most of them out of England. At that point, the only WACs that were staying in England were attached to the Air Force, the 8th Air Force, the 9th Air Force, and Strategic Air Forces. But the 9th and Strategic Air Forces ended up moving onto the continent themselves. The head of the Forward Echelon Communications Zone was Isabel Kane. She was a captain. She was part of the very first training class of WACs, originally from Tacoma, Washington. And she was the head of these women. She made sure that camp was organized. Bing Crosby did actually end up showing up in the apple orchard shortly before they moved on to Paris. And the unit, I think, to make up for how rough the camp was, ended up billeted in hotels like the Ritz in Paris. So while they were in rough field conditions, it was pretty temporary. And much like the GIs, they were on the point system for coming home. So because they were non-combatants, their point system was a little modified. And this was true for WACs serving overseas. There were a little over 10,000 WACs that served overseas in every theater of the war, out of 150,000 women total that served throughout the war. Peak strength was about 99,000. But throughout the war, those who chose to leave during the transition period included, there was 150,000. So not the majority of them ending up overseas. Most of them stayed stateside. And when they started coming home, they, again, had full military status with the passage of the WAC bill in 1943. They had full rights and privileges. They were an emergency reserve. And the author of the WAC bill, Edith Norris Rogers, was actually the co-author of the GI bill as well. So she made sure that it was not gendered language, that everyone had access to the GI bill. It wasn't just the men. However, women did not use it at the same rates as the men. Some of it was because to join the WAC, you had to have some sort of schooling. So many of the WACs actually already had their college degree. So if you already have your college degree, you've had your big excitement in going overseas, in joining the military, and you're heading home and we have the remasculization in the post-war period, why would you go back for another degree that you're probably not going to use? Also, colleges had finite amounts of spots. Like, not everybody could get a spot at colleges, and colleges were favoring men over women, even the co-ed schools. So you don't see as much use of the GI Bill by women, but it's not the, sometimes it gets put as a negative, more of a misogynistic thing than it actually was. Where the misogyny actually happened was when women were becoming veterans and how they were viewed as veterans. And you have accounts from WACs who served overseas. Dorothy Millard Wyrick served with the 66th, 69th Post Headquarters Company. They were some of the first WACs overseas, ending up over there early in '43 in North Africa. They were assigned to Mark Clark's 5th Army Headquarters, so they moved from Mostaganem, North Africa, to Naples, Italy, and then ended up bivouacking their way up the boot of Italy. They spent more time in the field than any other WAC unit. They were the most forward of any WAC unit worldwide. And they were in pretty rough conditions themselves. Wyrick talks about being in a communications trailer during the bombing of Monte Cassino, and an Allied bomb was misdropped near their trailer, and it shook the trailer. It threw her out of her seat. And it was, friendly fire at that point, but they were still at risk. I mean, other misdrop bombs killed our own. So she makes it home, and she's in her uniform. She has her ruptured duct, saying that she is newly out. She has her overseas stripes on her sleeve, and the gate guard stops her, spits on her, and said, "You're the reason that I spent my war over here," because of her overseas stripes. She was not alone in that. Another WAC, Grace Porter Miller, who served with the 8th Air Force in England, she was the only one of her siblings to serve overseas. Her father had served in World War I. Her brothers were older. They were farmers. They had families. They were hitting many of the exemptions, so they were not drafted. And her dad was so proud of the fact that she was the one carrying on the tradition. She gets home after serving overseas, and her dad takes her immediately to the American Legion so she can join, so they can do that together because they're the two veterans of the family. They allow her to join, and afterwards her father's going around the room to introduce her to various people, and they all turn their backs on her and will not talk to her, will not acknowledge her. She writes that it wasn't until a county fair in the 1960s, when they asked everyone who had served to stand up, that she was ever publicly recognized as a veteran. She also talks about the early days when they were working on creating the Women's Military Memorial, that one of the, she just called him a Southern senator. She didn't say what state or name him or anything, but that he was quoted as saying, "Well, can't they just get a plaque somewhere beside the K-9 Corps?" So the homecoming experience for World War II, we think of the greatest generation, But it has become this concept of the male combat veteran, and we've forgotten the women. Now, when I talk to other groups, sometimes I'll start out in third person and I'll say, when you think of women in World War II, what do you think of? And I'll have people shouting out, nurses, Rosie the Riveter. It is very rare that I ever have anyone mention the Women's Army Corps. And they were the largest group of women to serve during World War II. Again, 150,000 of them out of 350,000 women total who served during World War II in the uniformed services. So my challenge is start thinking about the WAC, start thinking about what they were doing. I mean, when they started in 42, there were 18 occupational specialties that a WAC could do. By 1944, they were advertising more than 239 occupational specialties for the WAC. And if you actually go beyond just what's being advertised, it was closer to 400 occupational specialties. So if you can think of it, and it wasn't combat, and it wasn't nursing, because that was the Army Nurse Corps, they could do some nursing support, medical technician, things like that, but they weren't nurses. WACs were probably doing it, and they were doing it worldwide. So at this point, now that I've kind of given you the overview, both the first person, a little bit third person, I'd love to open up for questions. That is a great question. A very, very small number. So when the WAC was created, oh, sorry, the question, if anybody else didn't hear it, how many WACs stayed in service after the end of the war? So when the WAC was created, it was an emergency reserve. They only enlisted for the duration of the war plus 6 months. So after that 6-month peacetime period, that was enough time for demobilization. It was supposed to just disappear. We weren't going to need women in uniform. And that was common for all of the women's services. Like, doesn't matter what branch you were in, the women were just a temporary emergency thing, except the nurses. They had a long tradition. The Army Nurse Corps had been started in 1902 and the Navy Nurse Corps in 1908. So they were firmly established, even though they only had relative rank until World War II. That's a much different story and different presentation. So we start demobilization. And they realized that, you know, this experiment of bringing women into the Army worked out way better than we thought. Maybe we don't want to fully end this. So the second director of the Women's Army Corps, Westray Battle Boyce, was in charge at this time. And she starts making movements to keep a small corps of women in DC and at Fort Des Moines. And they are going to stay and they're going to revamp the WAC. And they are doing some very quiet work. We've stopped training by 1946. We're not training any new WACs. We've actually then, in 47, we shutter Fort Des Moines, the last training center to exist. But in 1948, President Truman signs the Women's Services Integration Act. And at that point, all of the women's branches become a permanent part of the US military. They bring back recruiting, they bring back training. At this point, it's now moved to Camp Lee, Virginia. And I think at that point it was about 1,500 women left, maybe down to 1,000, again from 150,000 and a peak of 99,000 down to that. The Women's Army Corps stays in existence until 1978. Their next peak happened in the early 1970s, and it was about 35,000 women. So they never got close to the numbers they had in World War II, even through Korea, Vietnam, and they served overseas in both of those as well. Up front.
You said that the women who joined were required to have an education, and was that a college education? And why was that? I mean, were the jobs that the women were doing, did they require that level of education?
Great question. So, because it was an all-volunteer force and it was such an experimental thing, they really wanted the cream of the crop. They wanted the best of the best. So they were so concerned about all of the horrible things that had been said about the WAC during the early days during the slander campaign proved it, that something was wrong with these women, that they wanted to join this traditionally male space, that they wanted to be above reproach. So to be a private in the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps or the Women's Army Corps, you had to be over 21. You had to have a high school diploma. They ended up dropping that down to at least most of high school. But they really preferred a high school diploma and like 2 years of work experience. You had to go through a series of mental fitness interviews, character interviews, as well as physical examinations. It was harder to become a private in the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps or the Women's Army Corps than it was to become a lieutenant in the Man's Army. And that's why then the GI Bill. But to become an officer, it was a 2-year college degree minimum, preferred a 4-year. When they opened up to the very first WAC training classes in July of 1942, they thought the recruiting between May and July, they'd get maybe 1,500 women putting in for 440 slots. They received over 35,000 applications. From then, they narrowed it down to about 1,100 to fill out the first 3 classes. So you're getting women with master's degrees. And they talk about in the first training classes, they're being trained by guys who just graduated from ROTC like 2 months before. And they have no training experience. They have no Army experience. You know, they like minty guys. And there's really great accounts about how they feel sorry for them, and they let them trip over their tongues. There's WAC accounts where they talk about the lieutenant who's teaching them has a captain behind him sitting in the back of the room interrupting, going, no, wait, start over, try again. What he means to say is this. And it took them a while, and some of the women talk about being disappointed because they thought that these classes were going to be the same level of the college classes they just went through. You know, they have to meet all of these high standards, and now they're in these silly little classes taught by somebody who doesn't know the material themselves. So yeah, it was a lot of growing pains for both the WACs, the early women in uniform, and for the Army itself to learn how to handle women in uniform and how to train these women who are different from what they'd trained before. So during World War II, the Air Force was part of the Army. So you had the Army Air Corps until January of 1942, and then it became the Army Air Forces. And they stayed that way until 1947. So all of the women who served with the Army Air Force during World War II were part of the WAC, or you had the WASPs, who were not militarized during World War II. They didn't receive veteran status until the 1970s. So functionally during World War II, they were civilian contractors as they were ferrying the planes back and forth. That's also why they couldn't leave the United States, because they were civilians. We couldn't send civilian women overseas. It was a logistical nightmare. So they actually had a separate recruiting campaign for women to serve with the Army Air Forces. And that came out in 1943, and they called them airwacs. And the posters are great. But before you get to the airwac stage, the Army Air Forces were actually the first and the most welcoming of the Army branches to WACs. So in September of 1942, you get the first WACs leaving Fort Des Moines to go to duty stations. You get 2 units sent to Fort Sam Houston, Texas as a post headquarters company. You get 2 black WAC units sent to Fort Huachuca, Arizona. It was traditionally a Buffalo Soldier post, so that's why we're sending black WACs there, because it's historically a black post. And then you have 7 units along the eastern seaboard of the Aircraft Warning Service. And the Aircraft Warning Service up to this point had been run by male personnel and female civilian volunteers. So like even more of a volunteer level than the Red Cross. Like they you know, show up, great, what do you want me to do? I have my clipboard. And they have these giant, kind of like think risk boards in front of them and little models of planes, and they get reports of air traffic coming through, both the ones that we know of that are ours, civilian and military, as well as people who think they saw a German plane crossing the Atlantic. Now, we ended up disbanding that pretty early on because German planes were not crossing the Atlantic. The risk of getting bombed or attacked by air was not as big as we thought, and it could go back to being a volunteer thing. But that was, again, all of this was just a big experiment. Like, can women do this? Can women fit in? Can we make this work? That was so effective that the Army Air Forces, Hap Arnold says, we want 150,000 WACs for our own, and let's get up to 500,000 within 3 years. Like, they were so avidly willing to employ women in these support roles. The Army Air Forces were also the first to receive WACs in the European Theater of Operations. July 1943, the 1st WAC Separate Battalion arrives, and they are assigned to units under the 8th Air Force. So if you watched Masters of the Air when it came out earlier this year, if you look in the background, not the first couple episodes, but I think like episode 3 on, you start seeing WACs. Before that, all of those support roles that were filled by women were filled by British women. But the RAF starts saying, you know, you guys have your own women in uniform. Can you give ours back to us and start employing your own? But yeah, the Army Air Forces were leagues beyond even the Army Service Forces, who had created all of the WAC training procedures after they dropped the auxiliary status in employing WACs. So in 1947, when they split off, that's when you get women in the Air Force. Now the Marine Corps, the second part of your question, the Marines started accepting women when Congress told them they absolutely had to in October of 43. So you have the WACs as the first group. And again, we're not talking about nurses. They've been in existence since the aughts. So the WACs were created as the auxiliary in May of 1942. The waves come along in July of 1942, and basically what the Navy did at that point was they sat back, they watched the Army trip their way through creating the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, failing their way through creating women's uniforms, like fighting all their battles through Congress with everybody who thought women did not belong in the Army, and then said, okay, we figured out what not to do, we'll create the waves. One of the biggest things was the name. So, all right, saying WAC all the time is getting kind of silly, right? And I was at a conference earlier this year, and one of the people presenting with me said WAC jobs and got that. And it was at the World War II Museum. And that is not where you want people to laugh when you're trying to talk about a serious topic. But she was talking about occupations for women within the Women's Army Corps, and she said WAC jobs. During the war, you got get whacked, wacky, like so many terrible puns. So the Waves decided they weren't going to repeat that. And they came up with the name first and the words to match it second. So their official name is Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service, Waves. Very on brand, no silly nicknames. The Coast Guard came along next, creating the SPAR, Semper Paratus, Always Ready, also 2-SPAR or a SPAR on a ship. And then you get the U.S. Marine Corps Women's Reserve. And they never had an official nickname. Their nicknames were all very unofficial. And if you laugh, I will let you tell whoever is sitting beside you that didn't laugh. I'm not saying it up here. But the Holcomb, who was in charge of the Marines, said that they didn't need a nickname like WACs or Waves, that they were Marines, they received Marine training at a Marine installation, they work alongside Marines, they wear a Marine uniform. So even though they were the last to accept them, they were eventually the most egalitarian about it, with the exception of segregation. So the Women's Army Corps, much like the Army at the time, was segregated. There was a 10% rule in place from a study done in the 1920s by the Army War College. And that 10% rule was tied to the population percentage at large, which was 10.6%. So no more than 10.6% of the Army could be black because that was the population percentage. The Waves did not accept any black women until October of 1944. Ditto the SPARs, and I believe the SPARs, by the time the war ended and they disbanded, had 5 black women out of 11,000. The Marines did not allow any black women to enlist until after World War II.
Okay, hey John, I got a question here.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. It's quite interesting. Kristen Hanna has a bestseller out right now about women in Vietnam. And in it she traces especially the moral injury that women experienced by having to witness the kind of trauma that war brings with it. And then the struggles that women had to find their way back into the civilization again. Are there similar reports from the women in World War II?
Yes, so I have to admit I haven't read Kristen Hanna's book yet. It is sitting on my table at home, and it is my reward for getting through this semester of grad school is I get to read something for fun. But to answer your question about moral injuries, in a objective way, without getting into the violence aspect of it, if you were a member of the WAC and you became pregnant. If you were married, it was an honorable discharge. It was a medical discharge. If you were unmarried, it was a dishonorable discharge. Didn't matter how it happened. Didn't matter if it was willing or not. And it was your fault no matter what, because it's the 1940s and that's just how we viewed things. The trauma of war outside of that, there are some really good veteran accounts. Blanking on the book right now. There is one WAC account. She ends up starting in England, moving across to the continent, ends up in Belgium. And they end up in barracks that had been used by the German Mädchen. And she talks about the fact that when they get there, it's so dirty, they have to clean it out. And there are piles of prophylactics 2 feet tall on either side of the hallways going back to the latrines, because that's what the Germans used their women for. You also have the comfort women in China. And that's what the slander campaign tied back to. So, long answer to get back to what you actually asked. So the slander campaign was, what was wrong with these women is that they were serving as morale boosters to the men. That their whole point of service was to release a man for combat, which originally was one of the recruiting slogans, but because of the connotation of that, they got rid of it. The slander campaign got so bad that at one point a newspaper reports that 10,000 WACs are coming back from one theater pregnant and riddled with VD. Now at this point we had like 800 WACs at most in one theater. There was also a concern that the Women's Army Corps would attract lesbians at a rate exceeding that of the population at large. And Fort Oglethorpe actually had a witch hunt for predatory lesbians, their phrase, not mine, because a woman wrote home, or wrote to her congressman about her daughter who was being preyed upon. Whether that was true or not has not been proven. We cannot find the source material beyond that, but we can find a letter from the mother to the congressman. It's part of public record. But they did a major thing of that. Charity Adams Early, who was CEO of the 6888, she talks about it in her autobiography very briefly that, you know, everybody discussed it, but she never saw it. There was no proof of it. So there's that. But the trauma of seeing the impacts of war, we weren't talking about PTSD at that point. We were talking about being shell-shocked. And that was for frontline combat soldiers only. Rear echelon did not get that. Now I'm going to take it outside of the WAC and bring it much closer to home. My grandfather served in civil affairs during World War II. So civil affairs were military government. They would go behind the front lines after we liberated a town, and he would do the work to help set up the infrastructure, bring back some sort of non-occupation leadership to help the cities, towns, whatever, civilian population get back to some sort of normalcy. He saw a lot of really horrific things. I actually have a diary he kept from January of 1945 until April of 1945, at which point it stops abruptly. And I'm gonna get a little emotional here, sorry. When he moved into Germany. And being a historian and being able to get to things, I know why it stopped because I know where he ended up and I know what he started seeing. But even before that, he talked about seeing starving children, seeing people who were willing to do, a woman who was offering to do anything she could to get food for her child. My aunt was 3 when Grandpa got home. And she talks about being very young in the years after he got home and witnessing his breakdowns because at one point he dropped a plate of food and was so upset over wasting food that he broke down completely. So again, he was rear echelon. He wasn't getting help because he wasn't frontline. Even though the Army psychiatrists at that point were doing all of these studies to see what we could do, what war is doing, it wasn't for them. So hopefully that.
Were there fatalities among the women posted?
Yes, there were. So they weren't combat fatalities, and I cannot remember the number offhand. It was not a significant number. Most of them were disease or accident, plane crashes. Speaking of other popular books that have come out, Lost in Shangri-La by Mitchell Zukoff came out a decade or so ago, and it's about a gremlin crash in New Guinea and there were WACs killed on that. And it was May of 1945. Even though the war in the Pacific is still going on, they were on a sightseeing trip, and the plane crashed there. You have Verna Cox, who served with the 8th Air Force in England. She died of disease. You had some accidental poisonings that happened. But one of the most compelling ones was the 6888. So show of hands, who's heard of the 6888? Okay, great. I get to tell you guys about this. One, if you have Netflix, there's going to be a movie coming out on Netflix this fall. The 6888 was the first group of Black Women's Army Corps members to serve overseas during World War II. In February of 1945, they were sent to England to clear a 2-year backlog of mail that had accumulated. Now, this 2-year backlog was letters, was packages, and the backlog was not through any sort of ineptitude. It was just massive amounts of mail. So we all have those things where we're like, oh, this is a little too difficult. I'm going to set this aside and get back to it later. Well, this 2-year backlog of mail was all of those things that were too difficult to handle immediately, and they never had a chance to get back to it later. So, millions of piles of mail, airplane hangars full of bags of mail. And they're things that are just, they got damaged and you can't read the envelope. The locator card attached to the recipient has not been updated, so we don't actually know where they're going. Or there was an example that several of the women talk about where they would find letters that were just addressed to Junior. We have 3 million personnel in the ETO that we are delivering mail to, and you want me to find Junior? So, 2-year backlog of mail. They arrive, and they're really set up to fail. Like, this is years of back and forth of, we are sending white wax overseas, why are we not sending black wax overseas? So they're given 6 months to clear this backlog that has accumulated over 2 years. So, Charity Adams, CO of this unit, knows that they are set up to fail, knows that all of the eyes of the world are upon them. I mean, the last telegram that they get from Mary McLeod Bethune, who is good friends with FDR and Eleanor, and is a huge mover and shaker, you know, big since the suffrage movement, she sends them a telegram, and she says, the eyes of the world are watching you, carve out a niche for us. No pressure, right? So Adams goes, all right, what are we doing here at First Base Post Office? You guys have a 20-hour workday. We're going to make it a 24-hour workday. What are you doing to locator cards? All right, let's revamp it. They do it in 3 months. Their big reward for clearing this backlog in half the time is they get to go to Rouen, France, and do it all over again. And then later Paris, and they come back in March of 1946. At that point, they have cleared a backlog of an estimated 17 million pieces of mail. However, while they're stationed in Rouen in July of 1945, again, the war in Europe has ended. We are in occupation period. We're going through demobilization. There's more time to go sightsee and do things. 3 of their members are in a Jeep accident. 2 of them are killed instantly. 1 of them lingers for a few days before finally succumbing to her injuries. We're in a period of war, so nobody gets individual funerals at this point. Graves registration comes in, you get wrapped up, you get a very basic cross. Everything's going to come after the war with more permanent things. Same as everybody who's killed at this point, up to this point. However, their unit has such an esprit de corps, and they realize what they are doing and how isolated they have been. And again, all of the eyes of the world are upon them, that they raise the money to have funerals for their 3, that they get actual coffins for them, that they have probably one of the few actual formal funerals with full funerary rites that actually happen, not a wartime grave. They are 3 of the only 4 American women still buried in the Normandy American Cemetery. The 4th one's a woman who belonged to the Red Cross. The question up front. The question was, what was the highest rank a WAC officer could achieve in World War II? So, those of you who are really in the military history, again, the peak strength was 100,000. They were authorized for up to 150,000. We had 150,000 off the scope of the war. Should be a general, right? I mean, the Brits were even saying, like, you have how many thousands of women under you? Like, why are you not wearing stars? Ovida Culp Hobby was the first director of the WAC. She enlisted the day after the WAC was created. At that point, again, I joked earlier about Girl Scout rank. They had relative rank, and they called them third officer, second officer, third officer. Her official rank name was director, but it was equivalent to a colonel. She did not get any sort of promotion other than it stopped being relative, and then she was Colonel Hobby after they switched from auxiliary. So again, in charge of 99,000 and change women as a colonel. That didn't change until the 1960s. 67, 68, don't quote me on that year. Post-war WAC is not my specialty. When we get the first WAC Brigadier General, and at that point we also get the first Army Nurse Corps Brigadier General. They promote both of them at the same time. But during the war, Colonel was the highest you could achieve. Charity Adams mustered out as a lieutenant colonel. She was a major for most of her time overseas. And it's really interesting because you get this really rapid rise in rank for this corps of women just because they're so new and growing so fast. So you go from lieutenants up to majors very, very quickly, and then it plateaus out. And there was some resistance from the men from that. There's morale surveys that were done during the war. And they were doing those as we start sending WACs overseas to see how receptive our guys are going to be to having women over there. And there's an unnamed unknown officer attributed to the 8th Air Force, and he calls them 90-day wonders. And I'm like, what do you think most of your guys are? Also 90-day wonders. Like, we're in the emergency of war. Like, everybody's rising very quickly. But it was the fact that there were no old guard women at that point to balance it out was his biggest complaint.
Thank you very much, Molly. Thank you.
I grabbed a small stack, so if you want one, come on up, and I'll pass them out. But if you can't, just Google lipstick and war, and I'll pop up.